In 1942, Richard Riedel, a former Austro-Hungarian trade expert, compiled an analytical note on Eastern policy for the Reich Chancellery. The main conclusion for readers was very depressing: the Ost plan was a mistake. Even if Germany wins, it simply won't be physically able to colonize the USSR. There simply won't be enough people. The trip to the East was justified by the theory of Lebensraum living space. Germany needed colonies for development, and they could be taken in the East. Nazi leaders directly compared the fate of the Slavs with the fate of the Indians of America. As Rosenberg said, the task is to force the local population to extinction or emigration. The result was tens of millions of victims on the territory of the USSR and Poland. Although even among the Nazis, there were those who understood that such a policy was meaningless. However, at the beginning of the 20th century, it seemed to too many that the state could not become rich and strong without colonies. Hello everyone, I'm Egers Ryanov, and you're on the Redroom channel, where we talk about the dead and the dead, about history. And let's figure out today what's wrong with the colonies, whether the state needs them to achieve prosperity, and what leads to the belief that wealth is unattainable without violence and robbery. The idea that any country needs colonies dominated in the early 20th century. Absolutely every country wanted a colony. Even the head of the Polish Foreign Ministry in the 36th year in the League of Nations proposed a project, according to which the former colonies of Germany in Africa would be transferred to Poland. Naturally, in addition to the hopes of imperial greatness, the supporters of the idea that nothing can be achieved without a cork helmet had an economic conceptualization, primarily Marxist, and expressed, again primarily in the theory of the initial accumulation of capital. They say it is impossible to create economic growth without industrialization. This requires investments of superprofits, and the latter must be taken from somewhere. Rob the oppressed classes, expropriate something, or go and brutally rob some resource-rich tropical region. Well, or not tropical, but in general, frankly, any. The neo-Marxists of the 20th century developed this idea somewhat. In 1944, the future Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, wrote a book about the fact that English industrialization was paid for by the slave trade. Then this book will be fairly and much criticized. Indian historians have deduced a figure of $45 trillion exported by the British firm India. The School of the World of a Systematic Approach, headed by Emanuel Beinerstein, basically built a picture of the world where the countries of the conditional center are engaged in endless robbery of the countries of the conditional periphery, and the conviction that it is necessary to rape a neighbor's cow, and perhaps a sacred one, as well as to withdraw all the neighbor's values along the railroad built by slave hands in the name of universal prosperity, is probably one of the most destructive stupidities in human history. Moreover, this approach was destructive not only at the stage of sawing the world apart by Europeans, but also at the stage where countries that had never or almost never possessed colonies justified their various atrocities by saying that they were simply trying to catch up with the Europeans who had gained it all by dishonest labor, but thanks to the robbery of colonies. In the first case, we get, say, the Belgian Congo. By the way, we had a separate video about him, look at it. But in short, the Belgians were doing such a cruel thing in Africa that the international community even had to intervene, and not just express extreme concern, but actually demand that King Leopold stop all this at the beginning of the 20th century. In the second case, you can get, for example, Comrade Stalin, who similarly justified collectivization and methods of industrialization. In capitalist countries, industrialization usually took place mainly by robbing foreign countries, by robbing colonies or defeated countries. And therefore, it remains only to develop industry, to industrialize the country at the expense of internal accumulation, since the peasantry will certainly withstand this task. I am quoting a speech at the party plenum of the 28th year. But in principle you can find other articles and speeches of Comrade Djugashvili, where he spoke about the same thing. In any case, it is simply pointless to list the number of victims of both European colonialism and all kinds of 20th century regimes that justified their management methods with this colonialism, because if we do this, Then this whole video will turn into one endless mourning cloak for the long-lost shores of humanity. Let's better figure out if this whole game with colonies and expansion was worth the candle at all. Which country received the maximum profit from the colonies? No, not the UK or even France. By the middle of the 18th century, the Portuguese treasury's income consisted of 40% of income from the colonies. Then they just found gold in Brazil, and another golden rain fell on Lisbon. And yes, I didn't misspoke, because it's impossible to say that this rain was somehow particularly useful. Overseas expeditions of the Portuguese began in the first half of the 15th century, under Duke Henrique the Navigator. 1419th, the first colony Madeira. 1482nd, on the territory of modern Ghana, the Fort San Jorge Domino is being built. The first European trading post in tropical Africa. They sell gold and slaves. In 1488, Bartolomeo Desch rounded the Cape of Good Hope. In 1498, Vasco da Gama fulfilled the dream of all European traders. He found a direct route to India by passing Muslim lands. In the 1500th, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, just 8 years after Columbus, reached the shores of America and discovered Brazil. In 1511, Afonso Tolbuquerque founded a colony in Malacca. And in 1517, Rafael Perestrello arrived in Guangzhou, launching regular trade of the Celestial Empire with Europe. By the middle of the 16th century, Portugal had taken over a huge colonial empire from Brazil to Malacca. As a gift to the Treaty of Sayas, the Pope divided literally the whole world outside of Europe between Spain and Portugal. True, the Portuguese will eventually lose Indonesia and Sri Lanka, but the remaining Brazil, Goa, Macau, Angola, Mozambique with their gold, sugar, sandalwood, slaves and others are very, very much. However, the 17th and 18th centuries were an era not of prosperity, but of the deep decline of Portugal, once a great power, which has now become a poor agrarian country on the outskirts of Europe. And all because it's not only and not so much about how much money or, say, goods are produced, but how, in what quantity, and where they flow. The 15th century, and early modern times, or the late Middle Ages, as you prefer, is a time of increasing centralization of states. And in the case of Portugal, the government, in addition to strengthening itself, received an unlimited source of money. What could this lead to? Now more or less large-scale trade has become a trade in colonial goods. The entire economy was suddenly in the hands of the state. That is, in the hands of ship captains, commandants of overseas fortresses, tax collectors, and other government officials. To control the colonies, a developed military-industrial complex was needed. State shipyards, state gun factories, and so on. So the most profitable career in Portugal suddenly became a public career. To be an officer or an official, to cut government orders, and receive a salary with gold directly from the king. Since all these positions went to the nobility, the colonial rent was distributed among the nobles. The urban bourgeoisie, without which entrepreneurship is impossible, urban capitalism with its scale effect, the market and other jokes with an increase in labor productivity simply practically died out, unable to withstand competition with the state. By the way, rural life also existed in stagnation mode. Colonial money was still concentrated in coastal cities. So there was not much innovation in agriculture. The cake of the failed modernization was decorated with a tragicomic cherry. In 1497th year, the Portuguese monarch married the Spanish infanta, and the Spanish side demanded the expulsion of Jews from Portugal. At that time, Portugal was still a great empire, but this decision, of course, did not bring her anything good in the future. The Sephardian Purin Jewish community, up to the end of the 18th century, repeatedly asked various Portuguese kings to allow them to return, promising in return investments in the local economy. But they were repeatedly refused, with a tenacity worthy of better use. Sometimes there were ups in the standard of living, as in the early 18th century, when gold deposits were discovered in Brazil under King Juan V. But in the end, all the same, this gold turned into Lisbon palaces, without creating anything that could help the country to grow rich and develop in the future. So Portugal soon fell back to the state that a French diplomat of that time very frankly described as there is no science, no politics, no economy, no education in Portugal. Everything is indifferent to them. The Portuguese were laughingly called in the Russian Empire, Lord forgive me, the Negroes of Europe. The same thing happened in the mentioned Spain. State trade monopoly, lack of entrepreneurial culture, and, in addition, furious inflation during the price revolution. When everything was expensive in Spain except silver. Bankruptcy, endless wars, and the gradual loss of the status of a great power are attached. But Spain at the start had all the makings to become quite a powerful industrial country. For example, metallurgical production in the Basque Country did not do much for any England or France. But by the end of the 18th century, it had almost completely collapsed. As a result, due to the fact that Spain and Portugal produced little and had a lot of money, all this money eventually flowed into someone else's hands. And to some extent, the Ottoman Empire and China benefited even more from the discovery of America than the Spaniards, because they traded everything profitably, getting gold and other new jokes. The same corn or tobacco came to Turkey almost earlier than to Central Europe. And I am silent about all the tin that fell off during the collapse of the colonial empires. If Portugal still managed to somehow move away from the loss of Brazil relatively easily, then the Spaniards had a complete tin with their former colonies. In the 20s of the 19th century, Spain did not recognize the independence of the new states and declared a blockade against them. As a result, both the economies of the New World and the economy of the Spanish crown fell down. So, of the 5 colonial empires, England, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, 2 colonies did not bring practically anything good at a distance. But in other countries, things were not as smooth as it might seem. The board of the British Ostend Company became one of the triggers of the American Revolution. It brought India to the goal, but it hit the economy of England. We had to raise taxes and fight with the residents of the American colonies who were dissatisfied with this. Already in the 18th century, the entire huge state corporation of the Ostend Company was sitting on state subsidies and was actually a loss-making, super-corrupt enterprise. By the way, Alaska was once sold by the Russian Empire for a similar reason. The Russian-American company was unprofitable, and Alaska was an unprofitable subsidized piece of land. Colony management in general often devoured almost more resources than it brought. The Dutch Ostend Company also at some point turned into a de facto state organization and an institution for the control of colonies. And from that moment, of course, it became unprofitable, going bankrupt by the end of the 18th century. And soon after the Napoleonic Wars, the Netherlands will find itself in a state of the deepest crisis, which will drag on for 3/4 of the 19th century, and no colonies will help them effectively modernize. But neighboring Belgium succeeded, but largely thanks not to colonial goods, but directly to its own coal deposits. In general, the result is as follows. In 2 colonial empires, overseas regions brought only stagnation, preservation of medieval customs, inflation. The flow of a huge amount of money into the hands of a very narrow stratum of the population, and many, many, many wars. In 2 more empires, the effect of colonies is at least ambiguous. Access to colonial goods and 2 new markets was largely offset by the costs of the very principle of colony management. I'm going to say something dangerous in many ways, probably not obvious to someone, but super bloated state corporations, monopolists, corrupt officials are not exactly what really helps the country to get rich and develop. Probably, even with all this, Britain received quite a lot from the colonies, but we will return to this a little later. At the same time, when they say that all major European countries, they say, rose on the crest of colonies, they usually keep silent about Germany, which had no colonies at all for most of its history, except for a couple of Brandenburg trade outposts in Africa in the 17th century. Well, when they were almost entirely dated from the budget. Prussia has risen on the development of industry, international trade, science and education, on the development of empty territories within the country, and on the import of European migrants, for example, French Huguenots. When Bismarck was chancellor, he even opposed colonial expansion, arguing that colonies were not fundamentally needed for the economy, and it was very expensive to keep them. Then the Germans will change their policy, but characteristically, the German colonies will still remain unprofitable. At the same time, the richest country in modern Europe is Luxembourg. Not a colonial empire, but for a full-time, shabby principality until the end of the 19th century. Thanks to the iron ore deposits, the location, and the incredibly competent tax policy. and the policy of attracting foreign investment. By the way, you can see more about Luxembourg in our separate video at the link in the tips. Or here is another economic European miracle, the Irish one. Despite the fact that until 1800 and the first year, Ireland was literally in the status of a colony. However, even after being incorporated into the United Kingdom, the attitude of the British towards the island was quite colonial. Take, for example, the absolutely cannibalistic system of land lease and the attitude of the British to the famous potato famine. And although for the first time after independence Ireland remained a poor agrarian country, already in the 1960s, industrialization began on the island, and then the most powerful economic growth. The Celtic tiger grew whiskers, paws, claws, and tail not by robbing colonies, but by a competent tax policy, and attracting investment in education, medicine, and computer technology. Switzerland ranks third in terms of GDP per capita in Europe. I really can't remember a single famous Swiss colony, I'm sorry. By the way, there is also a separate video about her. On the 5th, Denmark, which had colonies on the island of St. Thomas in the Caribbean, Greenland, and Paravanposts in Africa. But Denmark did not rise on this. Firstly, all trade traffic between the Baltic and the rest of the world, literally, went through Copenhagen. Read the memoirs of any Russian navigator. There will definitely be a stop in Copenhagen. And secondly, Denmark occupied a neutral position during the Napoleonic Wars and could afford to trade both camps. And in Denmark, at the end of the 18th century, the lowest customs tariffs in Europe were established. In 7th place, above the UK, the Netherlands and Germany, we see Sweden. Well, Shanata definitely had a warlike empire, and this is true. And she even had conquered territories that can generally be considered colonies, for example, Finland. But only the active development of the Swedish economy began when it lost the status of a great empire. From the beginning of the 19th century, thanks to the fossil fuel, export orientation, the invention of a modern type of banknote, and the timely transition from protectionism to free trade. And although the Scandinavian countries remained outsiders until the 20th century, this is an excellent example of the fact that there is no direct connection between the well-being of European countries and the robbery of colonies. And, of course, they do not fit into the concept of wealth and prosperity in any way. They are impossible without robbing colonies. All these non-European countries that did not have colonies and still feel good. You know, for example, all sorts of former colonies there. South Korea, with its world-first spending on education, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, the United States, or the countries of the British Commonwealth. And all because the so-called robbery of colonies is nothing more than just the extraction of resources. And any extraction of resources can lead to its own variation of the resource curse when due to too easy access to money. Motivation for development, for new technologies, for the introduction of new cultural and economic practices, and so on disappears. When it comes to the immediate benefits of colonies for the economy, it usually turns out that it was not colonial goods that were really valuable, although sugar, cotton, and slaves managed to be the most important elements of the world trade system, but sales markets. That is, the value of the colony was largely the ability to trade, and not directly in the occupied lands. It is not surprising that Adam Smith, the author of the statement that man is an animal that makes deals, was a sharp critic of colonial policy. And since we have returned to the good old England, it must be said that the countries that received the most benefits from their colonies. This is exactly the same Great Britain and its neighbor on the other side of the Channel, were already regional European leaders by the time the colonial empire was built. France was the strongest and most populous power in Europe, while England, with its technological leap, industrial revolution, loom, and new approaches to society, was the most progressive. There is no single recipe for ensuring wealth and prosperity. Adam Smith spoke about free trade, while criticizing the mercantilist philosophers, who in turn once defended protectionist positions. Keynes and Friedman then argued about the degree of state intervention in the economy, about monetary policy. Schumpeter wrote about the principle of creative destruction, putting the leaps of technological development at the forefront. Now you can buy Robinson's famous book in any bookstore and read that states cannot become richer and more prosperous if they do not have institutions that would allow as many people as possible to participate in economic and political activities. Institutions and entrepreneurial culture, monetary and tax policy, international trade, and protection of the principles of private law, education and science. There are a huge number of points of view on the question of why countries are rich. It is complex, not the first and not the last generation of economists, historians, sociologists. Other scientists and politicians, philosophers are struggling with it. But none of all these people, who deserve at least minimal attention, offers as an answer to this question to go and rob a neighbor. By the way, you can participate in the prosperity of this channel. To do this, just subscribe to our Boost if you have a Russian card, or to Patreon if you have a map of another country. There you can watch videos the very first, do it without integrative advertising. You can communicate with us in our private chat in Telegram. By the way, do not forget to subscribe to Telegram too. Or you can just support us, if that's what you want. In any case, thank you to everyone who supports us there already. Thank you to everyone who watches these videos. Do not forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments, because YouTube loves it all very much. Well, we'll see you soon.